Protestantism. What is Protestantism? Let's go ahead and start off there.
I've been looking into the history of it. I've been reading a book about the actual history of like the Protestant Reformation as it was occurring. Obviously, if you're talking about the modern context, basically any Christian denomination that isn't Catholic or Orthodox is in some way Protestant. But historically, it was a movement in the 1500s that began as a attempt to reform the Catholic Church and then evolved into a kind of breakaway from the Catholic Church. That's why one of the early phrases, the time period is referred to as the Protestant Reformation, which does, as we look back on it, it doesn't really have the same quality as it was intended to have, because it again, like I said, it represented a breakaway rather than a reform.
More of a rejection of the actual...
Yeah, but in its inception, it was an attempt to reform the Catholic Church.
Okay.
And then that's where, probably the largest denominations of Protestantism that you can think of that survive to this day, that have a direct lineage, direct history with that movement is probably Baptists. I'd say that's the most direct.
Very, very much. Even though I would say their ideologies and the general theological stance of the Baptist Church is very different than like a Lutheran it's similar, but I think they've added a lot of things.
Oh yeah,
taken out a lot of things. I think a good starting point just for the Protestant conversation is the idea of sola scriptura.
Okay.
And whether or not people believe in the other teachings and writings of the church and other like church laws that are outside of the Bible itself. Because I feel like that's where, at least at surface level, most Protestants who haven't really thought a lot about why they're Protestant, that's kind of what they use to define. They say, I'm just a biblical Christian. Like,
why would the Bible alone.
Why would I believe in anything other than just what was written in the Bible?
I mean, that's basically one of the key arguments of modern Protestants is the kind of anti-clericalism. It's like, why does there is no earthly authority for God, so why should I listen to what these institutions have to say about the Bible when I can go to the Bible itself?
And they're inherently kind of against institution, because even within things like the Baptist or the Calvinist Church, there's structures, but there's not really as much. There's definitely interpretation, but there's no like creation. There's no hard, fast, set rules on a lot of things.
Exactly. Yeah.
Of course, on the more basic principles. I mean, like who Jesus was and what he said and things like that. Of course, but I was actually someone who viewed sola scriptura as like a definition for my Protestant leanings, and I will preface with this: I don't really prescribe to any denomination, and I don't mean to condemn any of them, but we have to talk about the fact that the Bible was written by people.
Yes.
Whether the words in them were prophesied by God through someone, they were written down by a person.
And more importantly, I think for the discussion of Protestantism specifically, is they were compiled into a specific canon by people, and those people being the church, what would, become the Catholic Church as we know it today.
The ecumenical councils, they decided these things. They decided like how they were going to refer to things. They decided pretty much interpretation of the Bible, which is why, I mean, when you get to Martin Luther, the father of Protestantism, one of his main things was that a layman could not read the Bible because it was in Latin. And I guess the argument of the Catholic Church for that was that you can interpret it a lot of different ways. Like me and you spoke about this. It's like with Nietzsche. A lot of times, like people will say, "Oh, well, Nietzsche was a fascist philosopher because Nazis used his ideologies," and no. I mean, you can take any philosophy and use it to interpret it in any way you want.
And that's one of the things with religion specifically. It's even broader than of a scale than someone like Nietzsche is a good example, because pretty much everybody post Nietzsche has been influenced or at least informed by what he laid out. And the same could be said even greater for the Bible. So you have the most disparate, you could be a communist and draw inspiration from the Bible. You could be a neo-Nazi and draw some inspiration from the Bible. Whether or not that's consistent is obviously debatable, but the potential is there, and it has been proven.
Which I think that's my a sentiment I share with both the Orthodox and the Catholic Church is that I do think that you shouldn't be able to just decide what you think was meant. I think you can in a way individually, but like there's something to be said about the line of succession from people that actually lived with Jesus Christ, because that's what we're talking about in the Catholic Church.
Yes.
I mean, Peter was given the keys of the kingdom, and there's been some controversies with papal, I guess, elections and things like that. But the church itself, the body, without even talking about its own issues, there is a direct line of succession that has been recorded and is known from the people who actually lived with Jesus Christ. So if you're building a religion around the words of Jesus, it would seem that that would be the place to go for it, you know?
Yes. And I think a case can be made that at the very least, you're talking about the kind of multiplicity of interpretations of the Bible. At the very least, a case can be made in regards to having some centralized, even if you don't view them as the absolute authority, having some kind of centralized hierarchy that lays down a framework for, this is the correct interpretation. Because if you have that central pole, if you have that focal point wherein everybody kind of initially gets their understanding, then even if there's deviation, it's deviation from a specific point. It's not radically all over the place like we see as a result of the Protestant Reformation in general.
And like the idea that I could just start a church and name it something and have my own interpretation and be considered the same. Yes, I might be worshiping the same, I guess, base idea, but that's not the same religion as like an original church if I don't accept all of those things. Like if I disagree with standardized practices of this established church that traces its roots back all the way to the founder of the entire idea of the religion, it's kind of it's a weird ground that you can walk then where it's not, I guess, as genuine in a way.
Well, it opens.
And I'm not just trying to condemn Protestants.
Absolutely, because I mean, when we're talking about the Protestant Reformation, I think we would both agree that there's definitely legitimate criticisms of the workings of the Catholic Church.
There's a reason I'm not a Catholic.
Yes. There's a reason why, and I think the vast majority of Americans specifically, but even Europeans generally, the vast majority of what I guess you could call the West or Christendom or whatever you use to refer to, there's a reason why they're not predominantly Catholic. And when we're discussing this, we're not trying to totally discount Protestantism, but I think it just have a kind of sober reflection on the outcome of it. And I think that's really where the essence of my concern comes from. Is not so much the act of splitting away from the Catholic Church, though I do have concerns regarding that specifically. It's more so the logical conclusion of it, which I think inarguably, if you look at the kind of individualistic nihilism that we're living in today in the West, it has its roots in Protestantism. It has its roots in this shift from traditional medieval European society to modern Protestant Europe.
And it gives you a way to justify things and a way to kind of hyper individualize your religion, because we all like to think, and I believe that God will speak to you in your life, specifically you, and maybe show you certain things. But the idea that I can define what God meant and what Jesus meant is kind of a slippery slope. I'm not saying that it's completely wrong, because I do believe that God speaks to us all individually, and we all have different paths to walk.
And even within the Catholic tradition, there's a clear influence of older pagan Western philosophy. The people like Thomas Aquinas, people like St. Augustine were inarguably influenced by the kind of rationalism of Plato and Aristotle. So to say that the Catholic Church was always this eternally rigid hierarchy where the Pope says one thing and that's the absolute way, and there's no possibility to interpret it any other way moving forward from that, is it's just not consistent with the actual existing history of Catholic theology.
And I think that pre-schism and pre-Holy Roman Empire, I think the church we would have seen would have been very different than what we see today.
Absolutely. And I think that's really, because when we're talking about Protestantism, I think it's very important to talk about why the Reformation happened. And a lot of people chalk it up to just simply, the Catholic Church was corrupt and people were getting tired of it. And that's obviously part of it, but the question as to why and how the Catholic Church changed, why it took so long for this to, because we're talking roughly 1,500 years of a direct lineage from Christ to the at the time contemporary Catholic Church. Why wasn't there any kind of movement like this aside from the schism prior to this? And I think when you look at Europe at the time of the Reformation, you're looking at a fundamental shift in the way that society and civilization at large is governed. The Catholic Church, I believe, prior to the Reformation, prior to what we could call modernity, because the Protestant Reformation really instigates the shift towards what we call modernity, the shift towards what we can maybe broadly refer to as liberal modernity. Mm-hmm. The role of the Catholic Church in the traditional era prior to this, the medieval times, is a kind of it's a universal state for Christendom. It's something that transcends any particular kingdom.
That's what Catholic means, universal.
Yes. It transcends any particular sense of nationhood. Before it almost, and when you look at the founding of the Catholic Church in Rome, it's kind of, it's almost a logical continuation of the Roman Empire in the effort to establish some kind of multinational, multi-ethnic state in Europe.
When you have an issue with your empire being spread across too many different cultures that all don't agree with each other, but they all follow the same God.
Yes.
If you own that God, not saying you can own God, but if you own that idea in a physical way.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying that's exactly what happened, but if we're going to question Protestantism and the fact of individuals to interpret things, I mean, arguably the same thing can be said about the Catholic Church,
And with the shift from traditionalism, you see the reason, like we said, Rome collapses because it's expanded far beyond its capacity to actually effectively govern its territory.
Yeah,
it's integrated far beyond its capacity. The Catholic Church kind of comes to supplant this. It, like you said, it provides a more metaphysical connection between all these people, where there's still official local governance in these kind of disparate nations, if you want to use that word, even though that's kind of a modern understanding of things. But these disparate kingdoms, there's local governance through the feudal hierarchies, lordships and kings, but they're united by this Catholic Church. With the rise of modernism, where we see the beginnings of the Protestant Reformation, you see I guess the best way to describe it would be a development beyond the necessity of that kind of universal cohesion, the development beyond the function of the Catholic Church, in that kings and their lords and the existing state structures began to, through the development of technology, through the development of infrastructure and
economic development,
Yes, just general economic development. They began to be able to govern wider swaths, wider, particular places, without the need for this kind of international cohesion. So you see, that's why the Reformation takes the form of a breakaway from the Catholic Church, exactly in the most disparate regions from, Rome and Italy generally remain Catholic.
It was the Germanic tribes.
Germany, France, and England are the hotbeds of what we could call Protestantism, because they exist on the periphery, and Denmark as well. They exist on the periphery of this, universal state.
It's also interesting that in the same, I guess, intellectual time period, you also see the birth of like European colonialism.
Yeah.
And the ability of, I mean, the British Empire stretched much further than the Roman Empire, and with almost more different kinds of people.
You can almost envision the Protestant Reformation as kind of a prelude to like World War I and World War II, in that it's this European infighting over authority, this contest.
Because whoever has the church has the authority as well. It's not just that you can cohesively combine your population, all these different ethnicities and cultures. It also at the same time gives the state supreme power. And if you do something against the law, you're not only breaking a law, you not only have the threat of physical punishment, but of spiritual punishment.
Exactly.
And so I think that's arguably a much better way to subjugate a population.
Absolutely. So if you have these developing economies in these disparate kingdoms, these disparate territories, like let's use England for an example. If England, it has transcended the need for the Catholic Church in terms of being able to govern a wide, if anything, if it's developed to the point wherein it thinks it can contend as a competitor with Rome and with Italy as the center of some kind of political body, then inevitably you have to imagine that some kind of split, some kind of friction is going to occur between these two. Because if you're subordinating yourself to who you perceive as your equal in terms of military and economic power, then eventually that contradiction is going to kind of break those two bodies apart in a abstract sense, but also a very literal sense.
So to circle back just a little bit, another main difference that I've found in my research of the Protestant church is the idea of a deeds-based entrance to heaven, whatever you define as heaven, because even among Catholics and Protestants there's different definitions of this.
Yeah.
But the difference between deeds getting you into heaven and faith alone. And I think that's something we really see kind of heightened in the Protestant Reformation, and with specifically Lutherans and Calvinists and Baptists, where it seems like to them they've kind of gotten away from the idea of sin keeping you from heaven.
Yes,
it's still there.
Well, that's Calvinism. That's the real substance of Calvinism, is this idea that it's not anything that you can do that you're predestined to either be saved by Christ and transcend to heaven, or be damned to hell. Before you're even born, before you do any action on earth, it's already been decided whether or not you're going to be in one or the other space, which contrasts to the kind of Catholic,
which still has some of those ideas in a way, but you still have to do something.
Yes, I heard it described one time. I think it was Thomas Aquinas that said that Catholics do believe in being saved by faith. They do believe in some kind of predestination, but they just aren't going to talk very loudly about it.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Well, there's still the idea that if you are committing sinful acts, it's going to drive you further away. Like, there still is the idea that you should be a good person. And that's present in Calvinism, and it's present in Protestantism. But they take it to this point where even in the services and the traditions that they do, you see if you go to a Baptist service, there's not much talk about how to live your life as a Christian. It's worship.
Yes. Which
is what they call it.
Yes.
They say they go to worship. And like that's the main difference I've seen, because I grew up Orthodox. And yes, we worship. But we read, it's almost like a history lesson. You read the text, you read the Gospels, you read an epistle, and you talk about how to implant that into your daily life.
Yes.
And you don't really hear that a lot in these newer churches. You do, but
I think especially in, obviously the seeds of this are sown in Protestantism in general, but I think especially in these kinds of non-denominational churches, it really transcends any kind of life lesson. It really turns from, here's how you live your life, here's a community that coexists with this particular lifestyle that we are willing to teach you, into I'm doing this because I have to, and it's almost it's ironic because early Protestantism, specifically Calvinism and the Puritan sects that were inspired by Calvinism, broke away from the kind of ritualism of the Catholic Church. They viewed this, taking the communion and the sacraments and doing all of these confession, all of these rituals that the Catholic Church was fond of, and even the Lutheran Church still clung on to. They viewed these as kind of creating a false consciousness for the person participating in them, where it's like, yeah, you can do these things, you can say that they're helping you and that they're going to get you into heaven, but in reality they have no impact on your status, on your salvation. It seems odd to me that when you look at modern Protestant, non-denominational, Baptist, whatever, in just the general Protestant milieu, it has almost become exclusively ritual. It's like you said, you're learning very little about how to live your life. You're learning very little about how to be a better person, how to live a Christian life. You're just worshiping. You're just doing the motions of going to church, singing the songs, hearing the preacher, going home.
And you see it in most Protestants you meet. They haven't even read the Bible.
Yes, it's surprising.
Or they have read, I call them the John 3:16 Christians.
Yeah,
they can all quote that. There's probably 100 tattoos of John 3:16 in any
1,000 businesses with just not even the actual quote, but just John 3:16. I think Cookout does that on there.
I don't even think they could quote it.
Yeah,
and you do see that, and it's almost like this disingenuous idea that I am saved, and I'm going to heaven, and all I have to do is ask Jesus really nicely, and it will happen. And I think that kind of gets away from... I think that, in my opinion, it almost mirrors the issues that Jesus had with the Jewish church. It mirrors because I say it's very opposite. They got so hung up on the law that they didn't really have the faith. Like, that was his main thing with them.
The Pharisees.
They would do things that were objectively wrong to people and be objectively bad people, because they had created all these laws that had been given to them, and all they cared about was the tradition, and they did not care about actually having faith and trying to reach out to God. And we're kind of seeing with these, especially these non-denominational churches, the other side of that coin.
Yes.
Where they don't care about any of the, and it's interesting.
Yes, absolutely.
Because even the Catholic Church, you see where they get kind of tied up in a lot of things outside of actually discussing what it means. You see that with like Aquinas and Augustine and those people. They do talk about the bigger picture ideas. Yeah,
and there's some like Augustine's or Augustine. I don't know how to say it. I'm not.
Catholics say Augustine.
Okay. I'm American.
At least the ones I've met.
I'm American. St. Augustine. His work, The City of God, is a great example of this kind of early ability to talk about the world, to talk about what is going on around you. City of God is like 85% of it is just Roman history, but it's through the lens of a saint, through the lens of a pious Catholic. And
theologian.
Yes, and he is interpreting the history and giving suggestion for moving forward, the foundation of a state after,
he's looking at the intersection of this material and of the spiritual.
Yes, and no doubt the significance of faith plays an important role in that, but also the actions of man play a significant role in that.
It's like there's an obviously different religion, but a Salahuddin quote. He's talking about they were going to war with the Christian Templars.
Yes.
And I guess one of his subordinates asked him why they weren't going to fight that day. Because they ended up, at one point, preparing for battle, and then both sides decided not to fight. And his subordinate asked him, why? Why would you not fight if God... He said, doesn't God choose the victors? He said, God does, but also we don't have enough men. He believed in God, and he believed that it wouldn't happen if God didn't want it to happen. But he basically had this idea where it was like, if maybe the fact that we don't have enough troops to win this battle is God acting, It's taking away from that literalist interpretation of Scripture. And we see that a lot with churches. And even now, we see it with the Protestant church, where they take this literal interpretation of, like, maybe when Jesus says the only way to heaven is through me. And they take it as, okay, all I have to do is just pray to Jesus.
Yeah.
And that's it.
He says that the way to heaven is through me, not that is it. You
Yeah.
know, there's you're going through him. It's inherently implied in that quote that it is a process. But he is the entry point towards a wider process.
And you have to take almost a slightly metaphorical understanding of the words, you know? I mean, he spoke in parables for a reason. He didn't, because he knew that was the issue with the Jewish church, was the literalism that they had, that materialism, that material view of Scripture, where they looked at it as just like, if I do these things, I will have a good life.
Yes.
And that's not, there's no faith in that. And so how do you word things to make people
have to contemplate, have to think, what does this mean? What implications does this have? And it's especially baffling when you see the kind of literalist interpretation taken to parables. It's like, do you think, like, you know, the phrase, you know, it's harder for a rich man to get into heaven than for a camel to get through the eye of the needle. Christ isn't saying that it's physically impossible. You can't take that literally, because no, it is literally impossible for a camel to get through the eye of the needle. It's a parable. It's a metaphor.
He's trying to explain something to you that will last.
Yes.
Because I mean, if Jesus just got on the mountain and was like, "Hey guys, stop killing each other, be nice," like it doesn't have the same effect.
Absolutely. It's like we talked about in the last episode, I believe, the idea that if you have the law but no faith, then you have no justification for the law. But if you have the faith, the flip side is also true. If you have the faith but no law, then you're still going to be misguided. You're still going to
God exists,
yes,
but you don't follow what he told you to do. That's even arguably, I think, worse in a way, to have faith and not. Because it's one thing to just follow the law. Yes, you're misguided, and it's definitely not working, and you're not living how God would like you to. But I just think we have a tendency as humans to take this hyper materialist approach. There was even an old Jewish parable that said it was don't mix certain things, but one of the most popular ones was don't mix wool and linen, and so therefore a lot of Jewish people won't or wouldn't wear wool and linen together. And the Muslims, there might be something to that, but it was meant to not mix different things. If that person is not of a good person or a believer, you shouldn't mix with them.
The Muslims have a similar thing where there's a hadith where the Prophet Muhammad says, "Don't mix milk and water." And he's speaking to merchants. He's saying don't dilute something and sell it as if it is the undiluted product. But you have, you know, literalist interpreters who won't. I mean, I don't know why you would put water in milk anyway. That sounds disgusting. But there are people who think like, no, you can't. You don't mix milk and water. It's like, no, that's not what he's not. He's saying don't dilute a product and sell it as though it's undiluted.
Exactly. And while there may be some truth to even some of these laws that they have, you have to read into them, and you have to have that. And that's where I agree with Protestants and Lutherans, because I think that you have to be able to interpret these things as well and read them as an individual. Because while the church fathers, many of them were very intelligent, very philosophical, very, very blessed men who knew lots of things and had great ways of understanding, interpreting, and explaining these things. But
they're still people.
What if someone there got into a position of power in the church and shouldn't have been?
Exactly.
Evil things happen. We see this happen, you know? And so then are we getting misinterpreted views of how to be a godly person, you know?
Exactly. And then with the idea of, you know, individual interpretation, like I said, I agree with you. There's definitely legitimacy there in that finally, like in the final instance, you need to look at this text and you need to decipher what it means. But especially you see this in early Baptist sects, like early Baptist sects. You see the development of the idea of continual revelation is that's what Max Weber calls it, is the idea that the Holy Spirit can literally speak through a human being, like a contemporary person. And leading up to today, people still believe this. You see this in Pentecostal churches all the time, the idea of, you know, the Holy Spirit embodying a human being, and they're speaking in tongues and they're receiving revelation from divinity itself. And from this, you know, we spoke in private to a group of Black Hebrew Israelites recently. I looked into it because we kind of went into it not having any idea what was going on. I looked into it. Do you know how this how this like tendency started, the idea to reinterpret history so that Africans specifically, but African Americans, African Americans specifically, but Africans in general are the true descendants of the Israelites. You know how that started?
How?
Continual revelation. The guy who started it heard it in a dream.
Okay. But I mean, if you see, as a Christian, I like to take a lot of the Bible, or most of it, all of it, I like to take it for truth, whether I interpret it as metaphor or not. Mm-hmm. But I mean, you see the people speaking in tongues in the Bible. There's a point where Paul says to people that, yes, I get it, the Holy Spirit is flowing through you, but there's no point in saying something to someone if they can't understand you. And
Yeah.
And even Paul himself, I mean, he didn't meet Jesus prior to the resurrection, Mm-hmm. So I mean, it's hard because there are holy people, and I believe that, and I believe there are people blessed, and the Holy Spirit does flow through them, and their words carry great authority. But how do you know?
Exactly, and that's where the ambiguity of the situation is what drives the kind of conservative mind, in my opinion, to say maybe we do just need some kind of hierarchy that says this is the official word, mm-hmm. and if something is way out of left field from that official word, it should be taken with scrutiny. There's room for, it's like a state. It's like a state. You have the central government. You have a central executive power. And at the end of the day, what he says goes. But you have room to disagree with him. Mm-hmm. Obviously, if you're way out of left field and you're saying stuff that doesn't make sense,
people are going to
be skeptical of it and maybe even stop you. Maybe the authorities of that institution do come and stop you because they see something dangerous in what you're saying. But it's the eternal dialectic between this kind of freedom of consciousness, this freedom to interpret and freedom to act and will, and the conservative restriction of impulse and I don't want to say incorrect attitudes.
I think it's also interesting the idea of how determinism really plays into all of this.
Yeah.
Because you have Protestants who, for the most part, believe in this, at least soft determinism, but mostly predestination. Mm-hmm. And they believe that God has set up the world in a certain way, and these things are going to happen for a reason. But they can't believe that God has chosen, like, a leader of the church.
Yeah, yeah.
Which it's hard for me, too, Mm-hmm. It's something that I think no one on the planet really knows. It comes into faith, and you have to have faith. And me as a Christian, not being part of a denomination, I do go to church to be part of a community of believers. Mm-hmm. But every day, that's one of the main things when I talk to God is asking, please just
make things see the truth. Make it make sense.
Even if it doesn't make sense to me, which it may not, like at least let me go towards the right thing.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's hard because I see parts of all of them that I like, and I see parts of all of them that I do not.
That's one of the things I do respect about the Catholic Church specifically, and it's something I didn't really process until I was older, because I was raised Catholic. Like, I went through the kind of first initiations of the Catholic Church.
First communion.
I've been baptized in the Catholic Church. I've received first communion. I've done the first confession.
What did you say in the first confession? Like,
dude,
how old
I was like, I think you're like 6. I remember sitting there and being like, I don't know what to say. I remember I started crying because it's very intense.
They want you to confess your sins to this man behind his
exactly.
veil.
I remember I was like, I should listen to my parents more. But I hadn't done anything, Or
nothing that you knew. Like, you didn't even probably understand what a sin was.
Exactly. And that's one of the criticisms I do have of the kind of institutionalization. That's one of the things I appreciate about Baptist is the idea of adult baptism.
Yeah.
I fundamentally think that
you should choose to be baptized.
Yes, because if you do it as an adult, you're entering into a new life. You're being reborn as a Christian, rather than this person was literally just born. Now he's going to be reborn as a Christian. It's like,
I was baptized. I don't remember my baptism.
I don't either.
It's crazy.
But what I was saying is that one of the things that the Catholics, at least linguistically, I'm not super into Catholic theology, so I don't know the full extent of the meaning when they use this phrase, but they refer very often to the mystery of God, the mystery of the cross, the mystery of the crucifixion.
That you will never understand.
Yes, there's an implicit understanding that true understanding is outside of us. It's not something we can penetrate into, at least not very deeply into.
And the only glimpse we really had of it on earth is Jesus.
Exactly.
I mean, we have people that were speaking things that were told to them, like Moses, but it's hard to contend with as a Christian. And there's part of me that I do respect the Catholic Church and the idea that you hold fast, and even if they do make mistakes, you're still in that church.
Yeah.
But the Catholics themselves, they believe if you aren't part of the Catholic Church, you can't go to heaven. Which is a weird thing. I don't know.
Yeah. Well, I think honestly, if you sincerely asked any denomination of any religion,
they would probably say that.
You know.
Yeah.
I think it takes a very conscious universalist to say, well, you might believe different things than me, but you're still capable of salvation.
And that could be a misunderstanding of mine, though, of the church. Because, the Catholic fathers, if you want to really learn about God from a philosophical standpoint, if you want to see reason prove to you why God exists, if you want something to, a buttress to support your faith, the Catholic Church has those things there. Me and you have mentioned Thomas Aquinas multiple times. Yeah. I've told you I want to do something on his 5 ways, but they find a way to everything they believe. If you do ask them whether you agree with it or not, they do have reason to back up everything. They quote scripture and they have reason, and they will actually talk with other philosophers. Even Thomas Aquinas said that other writers that have truth, it's God speaking through them as well. They're not biblical canon.
Well, if you look at, Aquinas is a great example, because if you look at his philosophical influences, like I mentioned earlier, they're pagans.
Yeah, it's Platonic.
Yes, Plato, Socrates, Aristotle. By all extents of our understanding, they were, pagans. They were part, and I guess you could make an argument for Plato and Socrates just because there are some insinuations in the Platonic dialogues.
He does refer to God as a universal force.
But if we're talking culturally, if we're talking what
they were pagans.
They were pagans.
They did ritual sacrifices and gifts to the gods.
Absolutely. And the ability for someone like Aquinas to utilize that in spite of a fundamental theological difference between the two speaks wonders. Islam has a long history of kind of Neoplatonism as well. There's a...
Because they accept some teachings of Jesus as well.
Oh, yeah.
Even if they disagree with the whole idea.
Yeah. Islam, I spoke to a Muslim man once who said that a Muslim's faith is incomplete without Jesus. Jesus is a significant figure in Islam, as he is in... Not in the identical sense that he is in Christianity, but he holds a similar... Basically, the way that it was explained to me is that there are three prophets of Islam that are, for Muslims, are the most important. It's Moses, Jesus, and then Muhammad.
Yeah, and those are the three that I would take as, it's the 3 major religions founded by those 3 major people.
Yes, exactly.
And I think, if you want to get a little bit schizo, as we like to say.
Okay.
I've been talking to you a little bit about this, and this is probably a bit maybe heretical.
Okay.
But the idea of Paul in the Bible.
Yeah. I am a firm Paul skeptic.
So. I'm a Paul skeptic. I'm not saying I don't believe, but I think that it's like we've said, people will say that's heretical. It's heresy. But if it's... What I'm trying to do is get closer to God. I'm trying to have truth,
Have a deeper understanding of this.
I'm not questioning Jesus in any way.
Yeah.
But there's no way to prove that Paul met Jesus. Exactly. Paul was in the desert with some other Roman soldiers of his own, and he saw Jesus, and he greatly influenced the church. I think the Catholic Church itself is Paul's church.
And I think that you can see...
even just from the fact that it was founded in Rome, they chose that as the head of it.
Exactly. I think you can see in Paul's revelation of Jesus, him seeing Jesus in the desert, I think you can see the impetus, the seed that grows into Protestantism through the Catholic Church. Because, we talk about the split, but Protestantism still, there's a direct lineage through the Catholic Church. It's a reaction to it. There would be no Protestantism without Catholicism.
Yeah.
So it's still inseparably connected. And I think you can see, like I said, the seed of that in Paul's revelation. Without Paul, it's definitely an interesting thought experiment. What would Christianity look like?
I think it would look a lot like Judaism.
Absolutely.
I think it would be a reformed version of Judaism. But we look at the ideas of, we look at Jesus in the Gospels and a couple other books, specifically James and Jude, the brothers of Christ. Those books, and if you compare them to the epistles, Corinthians, Romans, Ephesians, Galatians, all written by Paul, very different.
Yeah.
The epistles are faith-based. It talks about the only thing that is really important is that you just believe in Christ. But you look in the Gospels and you look in James and the book of Jude, it's about actions and deeds. And it was almost kind of taking, and they spoke very, very strongly about the fact that Jewish law still exists and those ideas are still there. And the respect for Isaiah and Moses and Elijah.
And in many instances, it's more extreme than Jewish law.
Yes.
Like in the instance of the idea that for a man to gaze upon a woman with any kind of lustful intentions is adultery in and of itself. You don't even have to actually commit the act of adultery with the woman. Just the thought is adultery. That's more extreme legalistically than Judaism. That is an explicit radicalization. It's not a and Christ says I came not to destroy the law but to reestablish it essentially. It's.
I think it was a reinterpretation is what he brought of the law. Because, I mean, there's not much in the New Testament really that's so different from the Old Testament. Love thy neighbor, all of that is still there.
Yeah.
He was reforming people's understanding of what was already there. And this is getting real deep, but if you look at the Dead Sea Scrolls, written before the birth of Christ, they mirror James and Jude, those books, and what they're talking about. In James and Jude, in the book of James, I think Jesus' name is mentioned once or twice in the entire book. Because they it's like we said earlier, the only way to heaven is through me. But not specifically him. And that's what James was kind of speaking on. He was just speaking about how to live your life, how to love your neighbor, how you should interact with people.
Christ is an example rather than the end all.
Exactly. And then you get into Corinthians and Romans and things, and they condone things. Like, I mean, Paul condones slavery. He says that if you're a slave, you should just be a slave and be good to your master. You should respect your master.
Yeah.
It's because the only thing that matters is that you have faith, and the only thing that matters is after you die.
Yeah.
Nothing in this world matters, which kind of doesn't even.
It doesn't track with the Gospels themselves.
No, it doesn't.
If that's the case, then why does Christ reprimand anyone in the Gospels? Why? What is the point in these specific lessons in how to live your life on this world? What is the purpose of that if all you have to do, if the only substantial thing that matters in a person's salvation is the acceptance of Christ as God?
He would have just came down with his almighty power, and not had to convince anyone. Just rain lightning down from the sky and heal people and do whatever, and people would just have faith and be like, I mean, this guy is God.
Yeah, you got to be real dense
to not get it at that point. But but to convince people to change the way they feel about things. One of the apostles that kind of really cemented this in my mind for me was James the Lesser, because there were two James.
Yeah.
James the Lesser historically had limp. He was like a broken man, but he had the power to heal, and he wasn't healed. He was a paralytic in one of his legs, and it's this idea that Jesus could have just healed him, and he would have believed in Jesus.
Yes,
but it's more powerful that James had that level of faith in Jesus without even having to have that miracle done to him. That's what, because he changed the way that James lived his life. And
it mirrors a lot of the examples of Christ healing people in the Gospels as well, where it's never set up like, I'll believe in you if you do this. They are the people who are coming to him to be healed already believe that he is capable of this.
Yeah.
And him doing it has no impact on their faith, because they already are in a state of faith, in a state of grace, as the Catholics would say.
And he says things like that. Your faith has healed you. It's not. He never really says that he heals people.
Yeah.
He said God's will, or if you will it, it shall be done, or your faith has healed you. Because that's what. Because it gets back to what we were talking about earlier. The difference between law and faith. You can be good, but it's that faith.
Yeah.
That does heal you. But you have to. But through the faith, you don't actually have real faith. I don't think unless you follow the law. Like I think the law is self-evident in a faithful person. But that is what sparks my interest in Islam as well.
Yes.
Because when I read Islam, it sounds like this old Christian ideas.
Exactly.
You know?
And I think most Muslims would agree with you on that. Most Muslims would say that I don't know if they would go as deep as to pinpoint a reason why. There's this kind of shift between early Christianity and modern Christianity, I guess even pre-modern Christianity, the shift between, we could say,
the original church.
Yeah, the original church and then the Pauline church.
Yeah.
I don't think they would go as far as to pinpoint the distinction there, but I think they would, for Islamic theology, all of the prophets came with the same message. It's just that our understanding of it was, distorted one way or the other.
Well, and then you get back to, in Islam, you get back to deeds. There is faith. If you don't have the faith and the love for God, it doesn't work, but you got to follow the rules too.
Yeah.
And that's what I think is beautiful. And also, I've heard people talk about this. One thing that's kind of made me interested in Islam is just the fact that it hasn't been broken off like Christianity has.
There's definitely been
sects.
Comparable schisms, I would say, to the Orthodox and Catholic schisms. Mm-hmm. But I think the real distinction is that in Islam there was never a true there was never a true successor to Muhammad. There's arguments about who the essential successor was. That's where you get the initial schism between the what would become the Sunnis and the Shias.
Because he didn't have sons, right? There was
he had children. I think he had a daughter.
Because there's one point where they're trying to chase like the genealogy, like who's closer to being related to Muhammad.
Yes, that's a big Shia thing. Is the genealogy, because basically the distinction between the Sunnis and the Shia is that the Sunnis historically recognized Abu Bakr as the successor to Muhammad, who was not related to him, but one of his companions, to use a Christian analogy, one of his disciples. Mm-hmm. And then the Shia, recognize Ali as the successor, who was married to the Prophet's daughter.
Okay.
So
not blood related to.
Not blood related, but his offspring was blood related. So that's the initial schism. And you could get into the history of it, but the point being, there was never an immediate successor. There was never a I'm giving you the keys to the kingdom moment. Mm-hmm. It was almost implied.
So it's kind of almost preserved those initial ideas.
Yes, exactly.
Because it's like they don't trust either. And that's beautiful.
Yeah.
And I think it almost resembles in a way early Judaism, because meeting a lot of I've met rabbis through the Orthodox Church because they are closer together, I would say. And Judaism, in a way, from what I've learned, in a way resembles, like when I see a true, faithful Jewish person who believes in God deeply, it's like, it's the same thing.
Mm-hmm. And Muslims, if you make the analogy to, early Judaism and early Christianity, Muslims agree with you in that they always, in the Quran, it mentions that the closest to you, the closest people to this new people that Muhammad is bringing into the world, is the Christians, and this is 500 AD. So we're still talking about the early early church. So he's saying,
but it's already becoming warped in a way.
Yes, he's saying that, and that's why in the Quran it says that the message has been sent as a clarifier. There's these problems that are occurring. There's this misunderstanding that's occurring, and the Quran is meant to serve as a clarification.
Do you think we're in a point of confusion again?
I think, and that's where I want to kind of circle back to one of the early things I talked about. I think that really when we're talking about Protestantism, I don't think we're talking about a significant theological shift. I think it's more so a sign of modernity, in that modernity itself, liberal capitalist modernity, wherever you want to place its impetus, wherever you want to say it came from this, I personally think that it was just a kind of natural development. Something was lost from pre-modernity. Something, you have a clear distinction in the way that people viewed reality itself. And I think that Protestantism, rather than being a cause of this change or a codependent factor, is a symptom wherein people become incapable of accepting any kind of institution, any kind of collective being. They become more individualized. And I mean, you see it in America is the best example for this. I don't understand, and I've talked to Muslims about this. I had a Muslim guy, he was from Palestine. He asked me, he was like, why are there churches on why are there like 5 churches on every street? Like, how do you guys...
I can walk to 6 from here.
Yeah, how do you guys disagree this much where you need, on one street you got 4 or 5 different churches? And it's a symptom of this hyper-individualization, something that I think the Muslim world and even Orthodoxy, even the Eastern Orthodox Church, has been able to avoid more so just from the merit of being on the periphery of this developing modernism.
When you go to Greece, there is like the church for the town.
Yeah.
And that's it.
Yeah, they're not going to argue, and it's not something that is exclusive to the West, but it is certainly a heightened issue in the West generally, and
I think
America
it comes
specifically.
with this liberal idea. So it's the liberalization, taking liberties with faith now as well. Exactly.
And I think that's the real important thing. That's one of the main reasons I wanted to talk about this, is because you have conservatives today. There's a vast swath. I would say the majority of conservatives in America are some degree of Protestantism.
Yes.
And I don't want to come at them. I don't want to condemn them for being Protestants, because that's not how I go to a Baptist church. You go to like a kind of non-denominational church. So we interact with them. We even, in some sense, find a place there. It's just that you have to critically analyze these things. If you're saying you're a conservative, if you're saying that something has gone wrong, it's like we talk about with Ted Kaczynski.
Yeah.
You can't just say we need to roll back the clock a little bit. You can't be a genuine conservative and say, oh, well, we just need to go back to the 50s and everything will be better and normal again, because this is how we got here. There's a lineage here. Yeah. So for you to be a conservative, and I'm not saying you can't be a conservative and say you're a Protestant. I'm saying that you just have to critically think about this. You have to say, is this institution in some way leading down the path that we are going? Is this a byproduct of the trajectory that we're going down right now?
And you have to. I don't understand how you can have faith and not at least question. Even the apostles themselves questioned Jesus. They more than anyone that's probably ever lived knew that Jesus was the Son of God and was like holy and was performing miracles, and they questioned him.
Yeah.
And like even with like the black Hebrew Israelites we met.
Yeah.
One of the main things I didn't understand about them was this: they felt so strongly, and their faith was very apparent.
Yes.
They had so much faith and so much belief, but I could tell they hadn't questioned it really. Yeah. Which is it's beautiful in a way to have that kind of faith, but I think that it's like I've told you before. I was listening to a Catholic theologian, and he was talking about when you go up to the altar for communion. He was talking about how a lot of times people get worried about how to hold your hands, and there's something as little as that as there's contention in the church of holding it above at your chest. Some people hold them down at their waist. Some people hold their hands out with their palms up. And he said that he had a child ask him. He said he was scared. He didn't want to offend God, and by doing it the wrong way. He said that alone, that thought is more important than the right way to do it.
Yeah.
Because that child has so much faith that he questions what he's doing because he believes so strongly in God. And so it's like, for you to have faith and just believe this person, this human, or whatever, you were born and someone told you how to believe in God, for you to not question that means you don't, in my opinion, like...
You're saying you almost have less faith because of your unwillingness to
question, to search for, to see if you actually are listening to the truth.
And I think that's also kind of a byproduct of modernity. I think there's a tendency you can draw wherein questioning something, asking questions becomes a attempt to discredit rather than an attempt to understand.
Yes.
For a lot of people today, asking someone a question, asking someone to justify something, so you might be saying it in a way where you just want to understand what they're saying. You just want clarification.
And they feel attacked.
But they feel like you are criticizing them through your questioning.
It's like, I want to understand you.
And I guess I can't say that it's entirely a byproduct of modernity, unless you want to draw the roots of modernity all the way back to like Socrates. Because Socrates, I mean, we talked about this in private as well, literally got murdered for asking people questions. Yes. So there's obviously, a certain point to where It's always been present in humanity, but that's an issue that we have to resolve.
Specifically as a Christian, if I claim that my example, the true ideal that I'm trying to follow, is in Jesus' footsteps, in his image, his whole thing was questioning. Was questioning the current superstructure.
Yes,
and
absolutely.
so, yes, this is the church that was set up by Jesus, that is after Jesus, but you don't think that if that church went wrong and Jesus came back for some reason, he would just not question it either? Like the idea, his whole thing was saying, you have these laws, you have these traditions, you have these beliefs, but are they glorifying God? And he taught his followers to question. And I think that there's a beauty in that, and there's a beauty in Protestantism, and there's a beauty in even the old Catholic leaders. But it's put me at this point in my life where I'm lost, I think, as far as an institution.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think searching for the essence of something, whatever it is, in the form is one of the primary. This is something I think you can chalk up to modernity. It is a fundamental misunderstanding of the relationship between what something is at its core and the shape it takes. You know, it's kind of like, imagine the Platonic forms. You know, it's like
there's these ideals, and then
well, you see a tree, right? And you know it's a tree because in your head you have this idea, there's an essential tree, you know, and it looks different than another tree,
but it's still it corresponds to that same thing in your brain.
But it's still a tree.
Yeah.
Now, if you're looking for the essence, that essence in the form, you're not going to find it because the form is always different. It's always changing. Even in a single tree itself, the tree is growing and developing. So one day, 1 minute after another, technically the form has altered, even if it's in just an unperceptible way. So to try to lock down the essential, especially when we're talking about religion, to try to lock down the essence of faith and God in a transient form is one of the primary issues. And that's where I think you can criticize the Protestant Reformation. And the early Protestants, especially Luther, I have an immense sympathy for Luther, because Luther's practice was essentially, it was a pragmatic separation from the church. He was.
There are things here that don't make sense.
There are things here that don't make sense, and I want to carry on this same thing, but you're going to excommunicate me. You are going to force a separation, but I'm going to carry on the essence with me. I think that impetus, I deeply sympathize. I think Calvin is really the one you can point to and be like,
modern Protestant thought.
You took this
and changed
it fundamentally in searching for a new form, in trying to establish an entirely new form of this essential doctrine. Because I mean, the form of the Lutheran Church is almost directly analogous to Catholicism. You know, but the essence is the same. I think the Calvinists, you know, and you see it in the anti-clericalism, in the rejection of ritualism, in the rejection of the sacraments, in the rejection of good deeds and confession, and all of these formal things, a infatuation with how something is structured rather than what's at its core. Whereas the early Reformation was saying, we need to make this form better. We need to improve it so it better reflects the essence.
I think that where I'm kind of at as a Christian, with all of the things we've talked about, is that I'm just looking for truth in everything around me. And I think that in order to become close to God, you don't have to subscribe to one specific thing. And I think that the church itself was established as a way to congregate and not to create Word of God in a way.
You're not creating a new doctrine. You're not even changing the doctrine. You're bringing people around something that exists. It's a hyper object. It's something that you can't perceive. It doesn't exist in the way that this table or this microphone exists. But it is here. It is present.
And if you look, it's there. And as long as your faith lines up with this truth that's been established, because I'm a strong believer in the material and spiritual truth, that the way things happen materially and the way our world is set up, even from like a scientific perspective, it was set up. If you believe in God and you believe God created it, He created things to work in a certain way for a reason.
Yes.
And that was kind of the way Aquinas looked at it.
Mm.
And so that's why I call myself, I don't know, I follow the Abrahamic belief system. I'm a 3-book believer. You know?
No, I got you, man. I think a suggestion to you and a suggestion to the audience is everybody should look into René Guénon.
Okay.
He was a philosopher in the, I believe, early 1900s. He started off very interested in Hinduism. He's a French guy, though.
Mm-hmm.
He's very interested in Hinduism. Eventually, he converted to Islam. But he's credited with founding what is called the perennialist school of thought. The idea that, and this is, I think, through his coming to understand this logically, it led him to Islam, because there's a lot of analogies in the way that Muslims view religion and the way that he kind of rationally came to understand religion. Basically, the perennialists believe that there's one perennial faith. There's one source code, point for all the expressions of religion on earth. There's one God. And the only difference is where and how that same essence has attained expression.
And how the signal is received.
Yes, essentially. Who is receiving it, what is, the nature of a people who are receiving it. And I think Guénon's traditionalism really, it fundamentally influenced the way that I understand my faith, in that I don't know, it brings you to a point where you recognize that these forms are transient. These things will change. They have changed. They've always changed over time. But what is eternal is God, and that is the one thing that stays, that doesn't change.